Hi YouTube, welcome back to my constant reader journey through the complete works of Stephen King, and in today's instalment we will be looking at everybody's favourite St. Bernard, the forever iconic Cujo. As always, I'm going to talk about the book, I'm going to talk about the movie that's based on the book, and my overall thoughts on the story. If you're new here and enjoy the video, please consider subscribing. I'm still obsessed with Stephen King. Don't think the hiatus between this review and the last one says anything about it. I have many more reviews in the pipeline, so let's begin. Now, of all the Stephen King books that I've read so far, this one surprised me the most in terms of expectation versus reality. Before I started Cujo, I pictured it being a very fun, very fast-paced monster tale about a rabid dog that's sort of let loose on some townspeople. So you can imagine my surprise when, for the first 200 pages at least, it's a very serious drama about the challenges of marriage and middle age. Cujo, the titular character, the namesake of the whole book, is, he spends most of the story as a tertiary character. And I guess that's sort of the point, like Cujo's downward spiral, if you will, his rabies, is enabled, it gets so much worse because of the neglect from everyone around him. So it makes sense that he's not a central character until the third act. But by the time we get to the standoff in the car, so much other stuff has happened that just felt so irrelevant. But we'll get into that. Stephen King has admitted that he has no memory of writing Cujo. Remember, this is an 80s King novel, and the 80s were sort of defined by the sort of peak of his battles with addiction. I would say that definitely comes across in just how confused the plot really is. Like, we spend so much time with the Trenton family, even though they aren't actually the owners of Cujo. Their association with the dog is completely happenstantial. Like, I think it would have been much more interesting if we spent more time in the perspective of Cujo, because, how many books have an animal as their sort of first person narrator? So that would have been a fun POV. And we could see like how mentally corrupted he becomes after the rabies starts to eat away at his brain. Instead, a lot of pages are dedicated to Donna's extramarital affair, and Charity Camber, she wants to escape her abusive husband. Both of these topics, they're well handled, but they just feel so bizarre in this story about a killer rabid dog. Like, it definitely doesn't help that this book has no chapters. There's no compartmentalisation at all of the narrative. It's one continuous stream. And I know that might be a silly criticism to some, but that matters. Like, these different side plots, there's no breaks between them. And so the whole thing together is very jarring. When asked about his inspiration, King cites a visit to an out-of-town mechanic for a repair, and the mechanic owned a St. Bernard that was very threatening towards Stephen King, and that immediately sparked the idea of writing this dog horror. Cujo, the name itself, is a bit of an enigma. There's lots of conflicting theories behind why he picked it. From my understanding, Cujo takes his name from Willie Wolfe, who was like a founding member of like a left-wing terrorist group. I think they were called like the Symbionese Liberation Army. He had the nickname like Cujo, but news outlets misspelled it as like Cujo. So it's clearly a product of like King's post-Vietnam liberal buzz. It wasn't until I read the very first page of this book that I realised Cujo is also an unofficial sequel to The Dead Zone. And that's an idea that's not really fleshed out. And I've not read The Dead Zone, so I couldn't really interpret it very well. We're introduced to the urban legend that is Frank Dodd, this evil serial killer who died in the Dead Zone. He now seems to haunt the town of Castle Rock, and they speculate that he might have possessed Cujo versus it just being an everyday rabid dog situation. Speaking of Castle Rock, this is almost sort of like the... excuse me. This is almost sort of like the capital city of Stephen King's main universe, and the setting for dozens of his stories. It actually takes its name from the rock in Lord of the Flies. It also has its own TV show. And Castle Rock is also the name of Rob Reiner's production company that started with Stand By Me, which is also a story related to this town. So the two books, Dead Zone, Cujo, they're also connected in the sense that Sheriff Bannerman, who dies at the end of Cujo, his replacement, Sheriff Alan Pangborn, appears in subsequent Castle Rock stories. So because of the events in Cujo, that's why there's a new sheriff in like The Dark Half, Needful Things, etc. But let's get into the meat of the book. The Trenton family. It consists of Vic and Donna, a married couple, and their 4-year-old son, Tad. They've recently moved into Castle Rock, Maine. They're originally from New York. It's like a nice sort of suburban retreat for them. Very typical sort of 1980s family generational move. As the reader, we know that this is a story about a killer dog. So we're essentially waiting for trouble in paradise. And we soon realise that there's several cracks in this family dynamic. Namely, the fact that Donna has been having an extramarital affair with a furniture handyman by the name of Steve Kemp. Vic has been, I guess you could say he's been a bit of a neglectful husband due to the challenges he's been faced with at work, which, to be brutally honest, make no sense at all. So Vic and his best friend Roger, they own an advertising agency, and it's called AdWorks. But they get into a scandal. Excuse me. They get into a scandal with this cereal company called Red Raspberry Zingers. And apparently, this cereal that's marketed at children contains a very strong red dye, so if a child is sick, their vomit comes up bright red and somewhat resembles internal bleeding. Now, I won't dispute the fact that that is a major design flaw, but how is that in any way the fault of the advertising agency? This confounded me so much. This problem that the book creates for us just doesn't make any sense. Surely Vic and Roger have nothing to do with the decision to make the cereal red. They just put together an ad campaign to show it off. They're just the marketing side. So it's so weird how the whole book milks tension out of this business scandal that would never happen. Like, if there was some kind of lawsuit against the Raspberry Zinger company and the use of this dye in the cereal, that would absolutely either affect the manufacturer or the design team of that cereal. How on earth, in a million years, would it ever come down to the advertisers? But hey, I won't get too mad about it. It doesn't really matter. It's just a way to propel the plot. A wise old lady also predicts that the current year, which is 1980, will see a record hot summer, which is foreshadowing. That's not so subtle. I'm almost surprised that Vic didn't make like a big ad saying like someone's gonna die later in the book from overexposure to heat. Speaking of Tad, he's scared of monsters, especially the ones he keeps seeing in his closet. So Vic comes up with some monster words. He has like a recitation that he repeats to Tad before putting him to bed. Again, this book has a lot of, let's call them ideas. I'm just not sure they all come together in a way that's fully realised. Like, the story is very messy. Like, by the end, we're left with so many loose ends and so many unanswered questions. But back to Donna. Her affair. She's had a handful of liaisons with Steve Kemp. She gets a guilty conscience about it and decides to call off the relationship. Steve is not used to being told no, so he doesn't react too kindly. there's this very tense exchange where she's like spilt a bottle of milk on the floor, like it's smashed, and while she's cleaning it up, Steve is contemplating like raping her. And that was a very effective scene. Like, I was taken aback. I was like, oh no, this is horrible. But what does this have to do with Cujo? What does any of this have to do with the killer dog? And I think King does a lot of justice to unhappy relationships and their inner workings. But it is a trope that he uses a lot. Like, I've not even read that many King books, and I'm already jaded by the repetition, particularly when this book has not one but two main couples who both have relationship issues. So for most of this book, it's really just couples therapy between the two of them. Steve is feeling vengeful, so he writes a letter to Vic's ad agency telling him about the affair. He even mentions a mole on the inside of her thigh that's sort of like proof that they've slept together. Is it inside of the thigh? It's somewhere, you know, intimate. And it's a very spiteful moment, and I was somewhat entertained that like King's typical liberal character is not the heroic protagonist. Instead, he's like a background character who's just a bit of an arsehole. So I thought that was a fun twist. Before Vic receives his letter, he takes Donna and Tad to the outskirts of town, which is where they meet Joe Chambers. He's a mechanic. He's recommended by a friend. Lots of things happen in this story on a whim. Like, it's definitely telling us about circumstance. You know, it's the novel equivalent of like the Swiss cheese model, how multiple events can line up to create an accident. And in this case, that accident is an untreated rabid dog that savages several people. So all these small, you know, fairly casual incidents all come together to create this whopping disaster. After the Trentons leave the Chambers garage, they're quite taken by the lovable pet St. Bernard Cujo, who chases a rabbit, but then he falls into a small hole in the ground, and the hole is actually this mouth to a cave that's filled with rabid bats. So when Cujo pokes his face into the cave to get the rabbit, one of the bats bites him and infects him with rabies. And immediately Cujo feels different. The book sort of gives us small windows into his sort of doggy POV and how he's become more and more aggressive as his brain starts to like rot away. I think this whole ordeal could have been a lot more fantastical, because it's upsetting to see this like lovable, friendly animal get hurt, especially when he was such a good dog to begin with. But the story's very routine. It's a very scientific pathology case. You know, it's a disease that affects animals every day. Maybe if King had made more of a connection between Cujo and Frank Dodd, it would feel more sinister. Because ultimately this whole thing just boils down to a small-scale, small-town accident. And the whole time I'm waiting for it to be something cooler, and it never quite gets there. It doesn't help that we now leave Cujo after one scene, and we have to sit through another 100 pages of domestic abuse rhetoric. Joe Chamber is the sort of domineering and abusive husband of Charity. She worries that their 10-year-old son, Brett, won't have a bright future ahead of him because Joe will just restrict him to being a trainee mechanic so he can help him around the garage. Charity has also won $5,000 in the local lottery, and so she uses this money to proposition Joe for a trip to visit her sister in Connecticut while Joe stays in Maine. Now, that's all very good and well, because it means Charity and Brett are out of town. They can't be killed by the big scary rabid dog that's, you know, in the horizon. It's strange how we spend so much time developing these characters only for two of them to just leave the state and never be physically implicated by Cujo in the third act of the book. And stranger still, in the chaos, like, we still follow up on Brett and Charity when they're in Connecticut with the sister. Like, there's this giant moment that I think could have been developed more, where Charity watches her son sleepwalking at night and he puts like a gravy boat on the floor thinking that he's feeding Cujo. I thought that was very eerie, since at this point Cujo has eaten a couple of people. So that kind of butterfly effect where Brett has this psychic connection to the dog, I thought that was cool. And just before they leave for Connecticut, Brett actually sees Cujo lurking in the fog, and he can tell that something's wrong with his dog, but because Charity's so desperate to get away, she won't do anything about Cujo, and he's left at the garage without any rabies treatment. So of course he gets much, much worse. Meanwhile, Vic, he's received Steve's letter about the affair, so he now knows that Donna's, infidelity. He goes through with his work. He still goes to New York for work. Again, this is all very effective. King really does have a knack for marriage politics. Like seeing Vic come to terms with Donna's betrayal, seeing Donna confessing to Vic how she feels old and like her best years are behind her. Like the dialogue, I feel bad criticising it because it's very heartfelt and it's very moving. It just feels out of place when the main body of your horror novel is about a rabid dog, and yet he's sort of peppered in between all of this marriage stuff. Maybe the problem is me because of my expectations versus reality, but I just don't know. Vic, he leaves Donna and Tad at home. It's sort of the inverse of the Chambers situation. Donna also has car trouble, so she travels to the Camber garage to get a repair done. Funnily enough, she makes the fatal decision to bring Tad along with her. So they're now on the way to the garage, and I think you know where this is going. The car, even though the car has problems with its engine, it conveniently works well enough to take them all the way to the garage, but then once they get to the garage, it won't start up again, and so they're sort of stranded there. Very convenient, but whatever, it's a horror. Cujo has been very busy. He wouldn't kill Brett because the boy had always treated him well, but he does not have the same respect for Gary Purvier, who's like Joe's sort of deadbeat drinking partner. He kills Gary. When Joe finds Gary's dead body, he also kills Joe. So these two deaths, they happen very quickly. They're not nearly as satisfying as I think King intended them to be. Because there's no sense of justice. Like, they're terrible people, but Brett and Charity are hundreds of miles away, so they don't know what's going on. And Joe and Gary were really just unlucky to be there. It also baffles me how King tells stories about abuse all the time, but so often he doesn't give the victims closure. It just devolves into like a revenge tale where the abuser has to like suffer and be punished. Like, I'm not defending Joe, he's clearly a piece of shit, but it's so strange how he gives victims a bloodlust, as if any victim would feel that way. Because at some point, I think Charity actually suspects that Cujo could be rabid, and then instead of worrying about Joe, she sort of fantasizes about what he might do to Joe. And I don't think that reaction is based in reality. I don't think a victim feels that way. But that's neither here nor there. Donna and Tad, they go to the dooryard. Donna goes looking for Joe. Instead, she finds Cujo. He's rabid, he's covered in blood. He chases her back into her car. This is the rest of the story. If you didn't enjoy bouncing around Maine in the first half, we're now going to spend the next 100 pages stuck in this car. Like, when I first brainstormed what I was going to talk about in this review, I was struck by how little I had to say about this part of the story, because it's painfully straightforward. Like, Donna and Tad are locked in the car during a historically hot summer. They have limited water that Donna sort of tries to save, but it doesn't last. And so they're suffering from dehydration that gets worse over time. The problem is, even though there's a phone in Joe's house that keeps ringing, Donna doesn't know if the front door to Camber's house is unlocked. and she can't take the risk because Cujo will be on her before she makes it back to the car. I feel like this would never be a problem nowadays because everyone has mobiles. You know, this isn't the early 80s anymore. She could just call the police from the car. But Cujo keeps slamming his body against the car to break it open. Tad keeps passing out from exhaustion. He's having seizures. Donna makes one failed attempt to get to the house and Cujo bites her for her troubles. So in addition to Tad, who's now like catatonic, Donna is infected with rabies with no access to immediate treatment. You know, she obviously needs a vaccine. Vic is still in New York, but Donna hasn't been answering her phone, so he's certain that something's has happened to her, something terrible. So even though she's, you know, the affair's still fresh on his mind, he still leaves New York, potentially jeopardising his work contract with Roger. But he doesn't care because, you know, he still loves Donna. And it's a shame that they couldn't have a happier ending because I do really like Victor Trenton. I think he's a great man. Like, he's one of the more heroic characters in King's sort of arsenal. And it's really sort of crushing what happens at the end. When Vic goes back to their house, he finds it's been ransacked and vandalised. He quickly realises that Steve Kemp trashed the house as a final act of revenge after Donna sort of bruised his male ego. It is somewhat refreshing to see King's writer trope be presented in this sort of negative context. You know, he's now someone you're supposed to hate. Steve is not like a Paul Sheldon or a Gordon LaChance. He's like a pro-liberal writer, sure, who somewhat resembles King, but he's not a hero or a main character. And I think that says a lot about King's maturity and how he's not like egotistical. He can create someone who might share a lot of values as King, but is still objectively a terrible person. And so I thought that was very refreshing. But realising that Donna and Tad are missing, Vic calls the police, who also suspect that Steve has kidnapped his wife and son to get back at Vic. Of course, we know that's not the case, but it's very cruel how they waste so much time following a lead that isn't true. Like, Tad and Donna are slowly being cooked in this car on the outskirts of town. And I don't blame Vic for not figuring out sooner that she went out to get her car fixed. But as a reader, it's more frustrating. Like, I don't get any entertainment from the way that this final act is dragged out. Sheriff Bannerman, he wants to go check personally that Donna went to Camber's garage. So he drives out there. And again, I think you know where this is going. The moment he steps out of his car, Cujo savages him. But that sort of gives Donna the distraction that she needs. And time is running out because Tad is dying. So she needs to get some fluids. So there's like a baseball bat on the floor. And she picks that up. When Cujo notices that she's got out of the car, he comes after her. She like whacks him a few times around the face with the bat. But then the bat breaks. But then this is perfect because when it breaks, she takes like the main shard, the like big splinter, and she like jabs it in Cujo's chest, which kills him. And then it's just cleanup. You know, it's a horrible mess. Vic shows up. Donna's killed Cujo, but she's so angry, she just keeps whacking that dead dog until Vic pulls her away from it. Tad, just in the nick of, has finally succumbed to his dehydration and his heat stroke in the 11th hour. The authorities have to pull Donna off of his dead body. It's very upsetting. She has to be taken to the hospital for rabies treatment. Cujo's head is, you know, decapitated for a biopsy, as they do with rabid animals, and then his remains are cremated and disposed of. Castle Rock has, you know, a bit of gossip about the whole incident, but it's largely forgotten about months later. The Trentons move on with their lives. Vic and Roger got the work contract, if that was really eating her, that loose end. Donna recovers from her rabies and they stay together. Charity gets a job to support Brett. They now have a new puppy called Willie. I don't know why it has that name. Probably would have made more sense to name it after his dad, seeing as he's now dead, but I guess not. Yeah, perhaps my biggest issue with this book is that Cujo is not a horror. It's just not. Like, sure, the idea itself is horrifying, and the film definitely makes it more suspenseful, but based on the reading experience alone, Cujo is a tragedy. We've already talked about how there's nothing too supernatural, there's nothing too fantastical about the events, and I'm not saying that a horror has to be otherworldly, but the story ends with Tad's death, and it just feels really sad. Like King has said, if he could change any singular thing from any of his books, he would let Tad live. And I agree, that would be a better ending. The film actually makes this adjustment because it's so depressing. You've gone through this whole book, you know, with Vic and Donna. Their marriage has just survived. You're sort of rooting for them because they seem like genuine people. And then they're just hit with this next challenge, having to like come to terms with the death of their infant child. And it just feels so serious. Why is this heavy subject material in a beast horror about a killer dog? So let's move on to the film. In 1983, Cujo was adapted into a movie, and I would argue that this is an underrated gem. Critics give it middling reviews, but I think it manages to improve on all of the main issues of the book, and it delivers a very well-paced, suspense-filled sort of 90-minute experience. And it's interesting because it was produced around the same time as The Dead Zone. They could have easily emphasised the connection between the two stories, but instead they do the opposite. Cujo doesn't even mention Frank Dodd. And I think maybe that is the right way to go because the connection was already very tenuous in the book, so they have to create a lot of new stuff and then you sort of lose the story. Stephen King famously sings the praises of this film. He's on record as saying that this is one of his personal favourite adaptations of his work, and he believes that actress Dee Wallace, her portrayal of Donna Trenton, is the best rendering of any of his characters. I think that's a bit hyperbolic. Not to take anything away from Dee Wallace, I mean, she's amazing, she's fabulous, but Kathy Bates in Misery, she's the only instance of a King adaptation winning an Oscar. So I think it's strange that he sort of puts Dee Wallace above her. And even if you don't agree with the Academy, I think Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, Morgan Freeman as Red, they're all objectively better performances. So I do find it strange that King thinks that's the best one of all his adaptations. But I guess that's his opinion. He also contributed a lot to the script of the movie, although he declined Writers Guild credit. I think to him, he saw it as a way of sort of correcting the problems with the original book, which is why ultimately Tad does survive in the film. He doesn't die from his dehydration. At some point, the script was actually given to John Carpenter, that he passed on directing it because he felt that the story wasn't strong enough, which I would agree with you, John Carpenter. But it's funny to think how different this film might have been if it had been made by John Carpenter, and how he was working on Christine around the same time as well, so he wasn't a stranger to adapting Stephen King. Like, can you imagine how challenging it must have been to work on the set of Cujo? Considering, like, famously you're not supposed to work with animals or children, this script has both in an abundance. Like, the finished product is amazing when you think about just how much of a mess, how time-consuming some of these scenes must have been to make. I think in total they used 5 different St. Bernard dogs with their trainers, and they also had Rottweilers because sometimes the St. Bernards didn't look aggressive enough. And they also had like an animatronic head that was designed to look like a St. Bernard. And they had a man wearing a dog costume. Of course, the dogs couldn't be used for the scenes where they were smashing against the car, because that would hurt the dogs. So that was why the mechanical head and the man dressed as the dog, they were used in those scenes. The dogs were very excitable, so their tails would actually be tied down to prevent the camera from picking up any wagging. However, there is one scene, I think it's when the Trentons first meet Cujo, you can actually see that his tail was wagging. They missed it out. And so that is a fun Easter egg to look for when you watch or rewatch Cujo. There's lots of cool behind the curtain tricks of the trade that went into making this film, and I appreciate that. Like, the animal trainers would put the dog's favourite toys inside the car to encourage the dog to jump onto the car and bark. Cujo, because he's a rabid dog, he constantly is supposed to have like foam around his mouth, and the foam was actually made out of egg whites and sugar, but it had to be reapplied in between scenes because the dogs would keep licking it off and eating it, which is just so adorable. There were multiple on-set accidents, and I think being the early 80s, it was easier to sort of work around these accidents, but these days it'd be a nightmare. There's a scene that mirrors the book where Tad is choking on his tongue, so Donna sort of puts her hand down his throat, but he like bites down on her hand by mistake. And in the film, the little boy who plays Tad actually did bite down on Dee Wallace's hand, hard enough that it drew blood. So that scene was completely method. Wallace's stunt double, Gene Coulter, was also injured on set. One of the dogs got a bit too excited and bit down on her nose, on like the bridge of her nose. But she was quickly treated at a nearby hospital without any further complications. One of the dogs that played Cujo also died shortly after production was wrapped due to sustaining an infection while on the set of the film. I couldn't find any further details, but as you can see, this was not an easy piece to put together. A lot of people were hurt. But I will say that overall, this is one of the better Stephen King adaptations. When you think about the challenges of the book and how difficult it would be to translate it into a film, like I'm sure today they'd probably just cop out and use CGI. But there are still scenes in this film that are genuinely scary. And I think having a dog lends itself well to jump scares, but they're not used as a crutch and they're genuinely scary. Like, all the unnecessary filler scenes in the book are cut. You know, we don't spend a single scene in Connecticut. In fact, the moment those two characters leave Maine, we don't see them again. Excuse me. And that's a welcome improvement. Because that third act should be solely about Donna and Tad. If you haven't already, I definitely recommend giving Cujo a watch. Ironically, I can't speak so kindly about the book, but this year also marks the 40th anniversary of the movie, so now's a great time to go watch it. I watched it on Prime, so if you have Amazon Prime, go watch Cujo. It's great. So let's wrap this up. I think Cujo has definitely cemented itself as one of the more iconic entries in the King universe, to the point where even people who aren't fans of his work know that Cujo is the killer dog one. But to be brutally honest, I was disappointed by this book. It's not awful by any means, but it has a bit of an identity crisis. King can't seem to decide whether it's a monster chiller about a rabid dog, or is it an abuse-filled tragedy on the ripple effect of a violent accident. And it's a shame because I would read both of those stories. But in Cujo, they're combined in this sort of Frankenstein way, and so you don't get to enjoy either one of them. But those are my thoughts. Stay tuned for more Stephen King reviews. Thank you for watching, and as always, toodaloo.